Hi, we move into Luke 14 today as our scene takes a big shift toward Jerusalem after the hinge that we saw last time where Jesus lamented Jerusalem, Jerusalem. And we saw that in our last scene as the scene shifts from concern about Jerusalem, as we saw in chapter 13, giving it one more chance, as we saw in the fig tree parable, and now shifting to the focus from the Israelites to the focus on elite Romans. And as I saw at the beginning of chapter 13, Luke's audience is not so much Israelites. Luke's audience is almost certainly the kind of people that we'll see referred to in this chapter, people who throw large banquets and wedding feasts and have rich friends and neighbors. Not that there weren't wealthy Israelites, that wasn't the central theme. The central theme for the Israelites or Judahites in Jesus' audience was, should they listen to the people in the synagogue or in the Jerusalem temple, who they understand as their authorities, who Jesus shows are collaborating with Rome and are not getting to the heart of the matter, for example, whether the Sabbath should be for liberating people from ailments or for just leaving them there and waiting till the next day. So we saw that resolved with the refusal of the synagogue leader to come around to Jesus as a representation of Jerusalem's house being abandoned, the Jerusalem temple being abandoned. And now we shift to a focus on what's really Luke's audience, which are the young adult Romans who are having to choose between Jesus' way and the way that they've been taught is the way of the gods, and that includes the way of patronage and the hierarchical society that put the gods at the top and the emperor parallel to the gods and the senators below that and the equestrians below that, and in a very careful hierarchy the poor and the needy at the bottom. And so Luke's audience would be more or less toward the top and be the kind of people who would expect the first seats and to be able to give the first seats. So it's they who are being challenged in this chapter. And as we'll see from what follows after the scenes about banquets here at the end, where Jesus tells them to hate their family, to carry the cross, to plan as if you were building a tower or planning for battle, that what's really at issue here is anticipating the consequences of one's choices. The meal scenes that we'll see after the initial story of the healing of the man with dropsy, which is symbolic of the whole chapter, involve people who did not anticipate what was going to happen. So they take one seat and then they're told to move to another seat. Or they invite certain people and those people refuse to come, and they are forced to invite whoever can come and whoever they can force to come in order not to be ashamed of having called for a banquet and having no guests. So what's at issue at this point for them is not that they need to know something new. As we explore the second half of the journey to Jerusalem, Luke's audience has heard on this side what many of the issues are and how Jesus' way is different than the Roman way that they're told is the way of the gods. What's at issue now, as we saw last time, is having the strength to be able to do it, to enter through that narrow door, to be willing to face into the consequences of your neighbors thinking you've gone crazy or rejected them or been disloyal, which in many ways people have. If they've chosen to follow Jesus, they've explicitly been disloyal to a way that was against Jesus. So Jesus is anticipating that if people are attracted to Jesus' way, they should anticipate what the consequences are, and that will involve a sharp separation between the people in their new community who embrace Jesus' way and those who they've left behind and rejected it. So we see our sequence there in these opening scenes, and scholars argue about whether we should see the entire chapter as a unified whole, and we'll look at that in a moment here, or just these first four passages. Let's look at two views of it we can see here. Aurora and Neri note here, coming from a social science perspective, they see 1 to 33 as a unified narrative, quote, in which conflicting ideological points of view are juxtaposed and contrasted. One view is quote-unquote exaltation-oriented, seeking to gain recognition before others. The other humiliation-oriented, avoiding the self-promotion of the first outlook. What they're talking about in the abstraction is what I was talking about in the specific. The exaltation orientation is that of the Roman orientation. The humiliation orientation is obviously that of Jesus. Or one might call it, in terms of that I've been using, the religion of empire and the religion of creation. In contrast, a story argues that just 1 to 24 is a unity, as 4 quote-unquote courses in the Great Banquet begun at 14:1 as an ABBA chiasm, as we'll see. There are also other ways to slice and dice the intratextual echoes, which is to say the way our given scene is echoing things we've seen before or things we'll see ahead. Not only does the fact that it's this part of this great chiasm highlight that we're going to see parallels here. For example, the man with dropsy here is parallel to the bent over woman, as we saw here in introducing these two chapters. But also what we see here, going to the house of a leader of the Pharisee to eat a meal on the Sabbath. Should we see this in relation to leaders? Should we see this in relation to houses? Should we see it in relation to Pharisees? Should we see it in relation to meals? Should we see it in relation to Sabbaths? All of those would help us understand what's going on. So let's look at it in two ways. Let's look at meal scenes here. And as we've been seeing, this is the last of the first 5 that form its own chiasm. And notice the ways that Luke has interlocking forms of structure. We saw how all of the end of 9 to 19 is one great chiasm. We saw last time how the end of 12 to the end of 13 is one chiasm. And now we can see in these meal scenes how interspersing amongst chapters 5 through 14 is this chiasm simply of the meals. So Luke has very carefully constructed a story. That's really something I've been trying to point out when we see even scenes that look parallel to those in Mark or Matthew, and I've noted the verbal changes, but there's also the difference in where they're placed, and that makes a huge difference in how things are interpreted. So if we look at his meal scenes, we see this here, and we notice how many of the meal scenes were at a Pharisee's house. The B sections in blue here were both at a Pharisee's house. But this one is contrasting with Levi's great banquet, not great blanket. Levi, a tax collector who represents the people we'll see in chapter 15, the tax collectors and sinners who may see themselves as outsiders or the lost. And there we'll see the outreach to make them found. The flip side of the rich going out to fill their halls with poor, but then God going out to include the poor fully. So we see this contrast here between the ruler of the Pharisee's house meal on the Sabbath called the doka and this as well, and only in those two places in the New Testament. And then we'll see some other meal scenes later. But we can also see this in terms of Sabbath controversies. And the color coding shows how the first two are connected in some ways, and then the second and third are connected in some ways, and the first and third are connected. So we're expected to hear all of these. So these first two in chapter 6 involve teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and we see that almost identical there. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him, and the word for watching is expressed here to find an accusation. It's clearly a hostile watching, and we see the exact same word here with this hostile watching. Then later, Jesus puts the question to them, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it? And we see a similar but not identical question here, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? We saw in the blue part here that they were seeking to find an accusation against him, the scribes and the Pharisees, and here it was the synagogue leader. And then we also saw that Jesus gives examples in this one and in this one, in 13 and 14, of what comparing an ox to a person who's in need. And then finally we see how in the end none of them can respond positively except for the crowd that rejoices. But the opponents are put to shame here. Here they're filled with fury, and here they simply can't respond. So we see how Luke is inviting us to go back through these and see how meal scenes are laid out, how synagogue scenes are laid out, how scenes with the Pharisees are laid out, and how Jesus responds to all of them. I'll also put up the whole chapter's key words, and as we do, we can see our opening scene doesn't really have any key words. It's a separate introduction, just like the story of the woman bent over was in chapter 13. But we see the great emphasis on those who have been called. And I translated it consistently here, whereas the New RSV and other translations often do not. Sometimes they refer to some of these as the guest or invited and things, but I wanted you to see how broadly this phrase about being called is. That doesn't necessarily imply divine call, and many scholars are very quick when we get into these scenes to suggest that the person who's holding the great dinner is God, but the text doesn't say so, and the behavior is very much not godlike according to Luke. So we have to be very careful not to equate rich people with God. And of course, that's exactly what the Romans would do. Would equate people's power with a God of power, but that's not the God of Jesus, we'll see. So we'll see later there's this repeated phrase. It's not exactly a key word, but a repeated phrase of your friends, your brothers, your relatives, or rich neighbors, who are illustrated by this here. And the flip side, the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, repeated exactly twice. The slave being the one who carries out the work of the person who's holding the dinner. And then it shifts after the meal stories to the question of discipleship. So it shifts from those being called to being my disciple. And notice all the negative, cannot be my disciple. So unless you do this, 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 and this is what's being anticipated. Here are stories of people who did not anticipate. They did not anticipate that the wealthy wouldn't invite them. They didn't anticipate that the place they take somebody else might come in, and the competition for honor here might displace them and embarrass them. So all of that is set up by this immediate story about dropsy here that we need to take a look at. So let's look at that as we go, and we'll see how that introduces what's to come. So We've already looked at this briefly about the two views that are juxtaposed according to my footnote there. So on one occasion, literally, and it happened, a frequent Lucan transition phase we've seen. The new RSV is very misleading here, and some scholars have followed it rather than the Greek, which is misleading, when Jesus was going to the house, which suggests that the scene is happening on the way to the house. And that may be reinforced a little bit by what we see in the beginning of the next scene, that people are beginning to choose their seats. And yet the literal Greek had come into the house, and other translations in my note below have more like that, went for a meal at the house or went into the house to eat. So it's certainly not suggesting they're outside on the way in, but they're in the process of going into the house. Pharisee's house we saw earlier, and that is part of the chiastic parallel we saw. And a leader of the Pharisees, an archon, we've seen other leaders before, leaders of the synagogue and others, but leader of the Pharisees is only here. So we don't know anything about what that means. The Pharisees were not hierarchical as such, and they didn't have any institutions. Like a leader of the synagogue would be someone responsible for leading the services and the economics of the synagogue. But the Pharisees have no specific space to call their own. They're more of an ideological group. They have a series of things they agree about. So what the role of this leader of the Pharisees is, we don't know, but it certainly joins him to other people who are leaders throughout Luke's gospel. And he's going there to eat a meal, or literally to eat bread, which will be echoed in verse 15 when someone interrupts Jesus to say, blessed is anyone who eats bread in the kingdom of God. We'll see that later. So to eat bread on the Sabbath, and are watching him closely. And as the note below highlights, always in the context of seeking evidence for persecution or prosecution. It was only previously in the other meal scene that we were just juxtaposing. And it's one other time when they're challenging him in those last scenes before the cross. So just then, Kai Idu, and behold, in front of him there was a man who had dropsy. And some scholars suggest that this is a setup, that the leader of the Pharisees invited him in on the Sabbath and has put this person there in order to test Jesus. It doesn't say that, but there's elements in the text that suggest that, although it doesn't have to be that. In front of him, in pros then, here literally means that there's somebody just there put in front of him. And someone, and the someone here will match the someone we saw with the mustard seed, just like the woman with the yeast matched the woman who was bent over. And who had dropsy, what we would now call edema, a building up of lymph, causing a watery appearance in whatever parts of the body it might mean. Here's a modern picture of someone with edema in a hand, so we can see that swollen. And what's at issue there is what that might have symbolized. And a number of scholars have tried to consider possibilities for that. Joel Green below notes that dropsy, quote, known in antiquity as the metaphorical label for money lovers, whom the Pharisees are called in 1614. Noting already there's nothing historically to link the Pharisees with money lovers, or literally silver lovers, as is described. They're a stand-in for Luke's audience. So the label for money lovers, the greedy, the rapacious. And Green continues, the person here, quote, would consider a vivid parable of Jesus' socially elite Pharisaical table companions as Jesus moves to heal the ones, so with regard to the others, his diagnosis pronounced and the prospect of health extended. But others see it differently. Michael Trainer, reading from an earth perspective, notes, the person with dropsy represents the struggle among human beings to let go of material possessiveness and befriend the earth. Such characterization mirrors the ecological attitude earlier of the wealthy landowner in the parable about the fig tree. Luke's Jesus seeks to heal this avaricious attitude. And one more. Hartstock notes that in the Greek world, dropsy was a well-known metaphor for greed, since the thirst cannot be satisfied with dropsy, which is to say that people keep drinking but are never satisfied. But recently, Derrett argues against the avarice view in favor of being puffed up or inflated, or as some might say, bloated. Whether it's inflated in the sense of full of oneself, and hence arrogant, or of self-importance, or of selfishness and greed, either way, that can be understood as an element of the Roman social order that's deemed normal. Although greed was not deemed normal, wealth is fine, but the avaricious seeking of more was deemed rude and inappropriate by the elite Romans, as it would be among many elite people until relatively recently, when we see things like the Wolves of Wall Street and celebrating greed. But before that, wealth was supposed to be gathered either by accident or through your strength or gift of the gods, and seeking to go after more would be deemed crude. So even the Romans were against greed. But what's at issue is not just greed, but the kind of social status that was taken for granted. So Jesus then, in the face of this, asked the lawyers and Pharisees, but literally Jesus answered. So it's not so much a question as it's an answer to the suggestion that they put this person in front of him and it calls for an answer. And whether it's a question or an answer depends upon the punctuation here. As Story suggests, rather than put it as a question as we hear in the No RSV, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? He suggests, surely it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath, just as in verse 5, surely any one of you would immediately pull his son or an ox from a pit on the Sabbath, right? And if we put it that way, it's not an open-ended question. It's a question demanding a certain kind of answer. Like it's obvious that we ought to be able to do this, right? The word for lawful literally means, is it possible, existen? Is it possible, can something stand out and come to be? Cure here is therapeuo, and he'll use that again. So is it or is it not? Last time with the woman, it wasn't about curing, it was about setting free. And that clearly was understood as what the Sabbath is about. This is something slightly different. But again, we've seen the conversation before, so it ought not to be too surprising to them. But they were silent. And the word for silent here is the word for Sabbath, rest, or quiet. They literally quieted themselves. I won't go through it now, but there are a number of different words in Greek that are translated silent in Luke, and that can be misleading. So this is they quieted themselves. And notice in 1 Thessalonians, it is translated as live quietly. So it's not just a matter of not speaking, but it's a matter of just quieting oneself completely. And Michelle Beth Dinkler here reviews 3 lines. She wrote an article just about the issue of silence, and she says, as a rhetorical strategy, silence can mean defiance. I refuse to answer your question. Silence is division. I disagree with you, but I won't say it out loud, and it's kind of a passive-aggressive form, or silence is deference. I'm afraid to speak because you may judge me for it. And she rejects all 3, arguing their silence is an intentional rhetorical strategy. And she says, continuing, the Pharisees used silence in order to avoid giving a response that will cast them in a negative light, a way for the Pharisees to save face and avoid shame when their honor has been challenged. And as Story continues here, their pregnant silence to both rhetorical questions means they cannot stand on any reasonable ground. So in the face of their being quiet, let's see what happens. Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. And this is again underscoring the suggestion that he's being used by the Pharisees here, that he's not shown as a real person. He doesn't come to Jesus. He expresses no please or thank you or any need at all. He doesn't talk. We see nothing about him other than that he's somebody with dropsy. So Jesus certainly doesn't see it as his fault. He heals him, but he's not the point of the story. The point is the Pharisees. So literally, he took hold of him, as he did the child in 9:47, and healed him, using a different word than cure here, and sent him away, or literally released him. So he's out of the scene. And for people, as we've seen in the previous story of the bent woman, who are advocates for people with disabilities, this can be a painful story because the person with the disability, although he's healed, is not really treated as a person. But that's simply just not the focus of the story here, without diminishing the painfulness that can be for people with disabilities who find that their voices are not raised up here. So he continues to speak to them. Then he said, if one of you has a child or an ox, and notice the ox a couple of times, and the issue of oxes in Exodus, where there's a whole lot of rules about what to do about oxes. And I highlighted here so you can see all the stuff about ox. An ox was an important animal. They're expensive, and they're key to one's farming and such, and they can get hurt, and they can hurt others. So there were a lot of rules about oxes, and people understood them. And if an ox falls, for example, in your neighbor's well, the neighbor's responsible for reimbursing you if you can't get the ox out of the well. But certainly, noting the equating here of a child with an ox, you'd pull either one of them out, wouldn't you? Of course you would. And yet their response is they were not strong enough to answer this. And we saw last time the question of being strong enough. As Dinkler notes on this response, if they say that healing is permitted, they will challenge their own traditional view of the law. If they respond that healing is not permitted, they will appear both unloving and, as Jesus' second question reveals, hypocritical. Faced with their inability to stake a verbal claim, they use the only weapon left in the rhetorical arsenal, silence. And then she finally notes they are reduced to grumbling about Jesus after this and then grumbling toward him. So with this scene set up, we will see how this sets up all these issues here about if somebody's inflated or seeking more, what happens. And we'll see people who are seeking status at a banquet or seeking to have their banquet become status. And when they don't plan properly, shame can come. And Jesus will continue trying to prepare them for anticipating that kind of shame by the end of the chapter. We'll continue with that next time. See you then.